By the time Saphira Payne found the tiny werewolf pup, he was alone, injured, and far from home. Hundreds of wolves were searching for him. A rival pack was hunting him. An entire kingdom was waiting for news. And one alpha king was beginning to fear he would never see his son again. Saphira knew none of that. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his bloodline. She didn't know that one of the most powerful alpha kings alive was desperately searching for him. She only knew he was suffering. And for Saphira Payne, that had always been enough. She picked him up, took him home, and changed all three of their lives forever. Chapter 1. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was gray and still. The next, the wind tore through the trees with the kind of force that made the village dogs go quiet, and the old women closed their shutters without being asked. Saphira Payne was in her workroom when it hit. She was grinding dried valerian root into powder, the way she did every Tuesday evening, when the first crack of thunder shook the jars on her shelf. She caught the nearest one before it fell, set it down carefully, listened. The wind had teeth tonight. She lived alone at the edge of the village, close enough to be found when someone needed her, far enough that no one dropped by without reason. It was an arrangement that had suited her for years. She told herself it still did. She banked the fire, pulled her cloak from the hook by the door, and stepped outside to check the shutters on the storage shed. That was when she heard it. Not the wind, not the thunder. Something underneath both of those things. Small. Irregular. Wrong. She stood very still in the freezing rain and listened. There, between two gusts. A sound like an animal in distress. High and thin and exhausted, the way a creature sounds when it has been crying for so long it has almost forgotten why. Saphira followed it without deciding to. She found him at the base of the old oak at the edge of the tree line, curled into himself, so wet and so still that she almost missed him in the dark. A wolf pup, tiny. His gray fur was plastered flat against his body, his breathing shallow and uneven. One of his front legs was pulled close to his chest at an angle that made her stomach tighten. She crouched down slowly, held out her hand. He didn't growl. He didn't flinch away. He just looked at her with eyes that were too old for something so small, dark and exhausted and stripped of everything except the most basic question any creature ever asks. Are you going to help me or not? I've got you, Saphira said quietly. It's all right. She wasn't sure if it was all right. She said it anyway. She unbuttoned her cloak and wrapped him inside it without hesitation, tucking him against her chest, feeling the rapid flutter of his heartbeat against her ribs. He was lighter than she expected, and warmer than he should have been, given how long he'd clearly been in the rain. Fever. Already. She turned back toward the house, walking quickly, one hand pressed against the bundle at her chest to hold him steady. He didn't struggle. He pressed closer instead, his small nose finding the warmth at the base of her throat, his body going fractionally less rigid as she moved. She didn't let herself think about where he had come from. She didn't let herself think about whether someone was looking for him, or what kind of wolf pup ended up alone in the middle of a storm this far from any known pack territory. There would be time for those questions later. Right now he was burning up and soaking wet, and his leg was injured and his heartbeat was too fast and irregular against her palm. Right now, there was only the work. She pushed through the door of her cottage, kicked it shut behind her, and carried him straight to the table nearest the fire. She set him down as gently as she could, and pulled the cloak back to look at him properly in the firelight. He blinked at her. Dark eyes, ears too big for his head. A small gray face that would have been almost comical in other circumstances. He made a sound, barely a sound, more like the idea of one, and pressed his chin down flat against the table. Saphira began her examination carefully, working from his injured leg upward, checking his breathing, his temperature, the inside of his mouth. It was only when she parted the wet fur at his neck to check for wounds that she found it. A small medallion, no wider than her thumbnail. Black metal, dark enough to be almost invisible against his fur. The surface was engraved with a symbol she didn't recognize. Something between a wolf's head and a crown, worn smooth at the edges from what must have been years of handling. She sat back slowly, looked at the medallion, looked at him. The pup had already closed his eyes again, as though whatever strength had kept him awake was finally gone. Saphira set the medallion down gently against his chest, filed the question away for later, the way she filed most things she didn't yet understand. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She worked through the night. The leg first. It wasn't broken. She established that within the first hour, relief loosening something tight in her chest. But the joint was badly swollen, and whatever he had done to it had left the surrounding tissue inflamed and hot to the touch. She cleaned it carefully, applied a compress of comfrey and cold water, and bound it with strips of clean linen. He bore it without sound. That, more than anything, concerned her. A pup in pain should whimper, should flinch, should make the ordinary noise of a creature that is hurting and wants the world to know it. The little one simply watched her work with eyes that were already glazing at the edges from fever. She moved to the fever next. Willow bark tea, brewed strong and cooled until it was warm rather than hot. She coaxed it into him a spoonful at a time, the way she had done with sick children before, and he swallowed it with what seemed like enormous effort. She checked his temperature again an hour later. It had not dropped. She added elderflower to the next batch, changed the compress on his leg, kept the fire built up high enough that the room was uncomfortably warm, because whatever his body needed right now, it was heat. By dawn, the fever was worse. She tried food then. A small piece of soft-cooked meat, held close enough for him to smell it without having to move. He turned his nose away. She tried again an hour later. Again he refused. His breathing had become audible in a way it hadn't been the night before, a faint catch at the top of each inhale that she did not like at all. She stood at her work table in the gray morning light and looked at what she had: comfrey, willow bark, elderflower, yarrow. Everything she would reach for with a human patient. Everything that should have been working. Everything that wasn't. She had done this before, had sat with sick animals, sick children, sick elders who had waited too long to ask for help. She knew what it looked like when something was beyond what she could offer. She knew it. She simply didn't want it to be true yet. She went back to him. He was lying on his side now, which was new. His eyes were open, but unfocused, tracking something she couldn't see. The medallion at his neck caught the firelight as his chest rose and fell. That small, worn symbol, wolf and crown, still carrying its question. She sat beside him on the floor and put one hand very gently on his side, the way she had learned calmed sick animals. Steady pressure, steady warmth, the simple animal message that something living was nearby and meant no harm. He exhaled slowly. Didn't improve, but didn't worsen either, for the length of time her hand was there. It was Marta who gave her the answer. Old Marta from the far end of the village, who came to the door mid-morning to return a borrowed pot, and found Saphira looking like she hadn't slept. "There's a healer," Marta said, after Saphira had explained. After Marta had looked at the pup with the careful eyes of someone who had seen many animals, and knew when one was in trouble. "Up the mountain. Old woman. Doesn't come down anymore." She paused. "People say she knows things the rest of us have forgotten." Saphira looked at the pup, looked at the window, where the sky was white and the wind was still moving through the trees. How far? 2 hours, maybe 3 in this weather. She looked at him again, his breathing, the heat coming off him in waves, the way his body had stopped fighting the way bodies were supposed to fight. There would be time for questions later. Right now there was only the decision. She wrapped him in the warmest thing she owned, a wool blanket thick enough to hold heat against the wind, and tucked him against her chest the way she had the night before. He pressed closer without being asked. His nose found the warmth at her throat. She picked up her pack, opened the door, and walked into the cold. The woman in the mountains was not what Saphira had expected. She had imagined someone ancient and theatrical, the kind of healer who kept bones hanging from the rafters and spoke in riddles. What she found, after 2.5 hours of climbing through wind that had no patience for anyone, was a small stone cabin with a well-kept roof and a lamp burning in the window. The woman who opened the door was old, certainly, but her eyes were sharp and immediate, the eyes of someone who had spent a long time watching people arrive at her door with problems they didn't know how to name. She looked at Saphira, looked at the bundle against her chest, stepped back without a word to let them in. Her name was Etta. She didn't offer it. Saphira learned it later, from a carved wooden cup on the shelf with the name worn into the grain. The cabin was warm and smelled of pine resin and something else, something medicinal and faintly sharp that Saphira couldn't identify. Dried herbs hung from every beam. The work table was cleaner than Saphira's own. Saphira set the pup down on the table Etta indicated and unwrapped him carefully. He had been still for most of the climb, too still, but his breathing had steadied slightly in the warmth of her cloak. Now, in the light of the cabin, he looked smaller than he had at home. Smaller and younger, and more fragile than any creature had a right to look. Etta examined him without speaking. Her hands were efficient and unhurried, moving across his leg, his ribs, pressing gently at his abdomen, lifting each eyelid in turn. Saphira watched and said nothing. She had learned, over years of working alongside older healers, that the most useful thing she could do during an examination was stay quiet and stay out of the way. It was when Etta reached the pup's neck that she paused. Her hands did not stop moving. Her expression did not change. But something shifted in the quality of her attention. A subtle recalibration, the kind that only someone watching very carefully would notice. She lifted the medallion between 2 fingers, held it toward the lamp. The silence in the cabin changed. Saphira felt it without being able to name it. The way the air in a room changes when something important has entered it. Etta set the medallion down against the pup's chest. Gently. More gently than she had handled anything else. Then she looked up. "Where did you find him?" Her voice was the same as before. Quiet, unhurried. But the question was not the same as before. It had a different weight to it. The weight of someone who was asking not because she didn't know, but because she needed to understand how much Saphira knew. At the edge of the tree line, Saphira said, "During the storm, he was alone." Etta looked at her for a long moment. "And the medallion. Did you put that on him?" "No, he was already wearing it when I found him." Another silence. Etta looked back at the pup, at the medallion, at the pup again. "You did well to bring him here," she said finally. "Leave him with me tonight. Come back in the morning." "I'd rather stay," Saphira said. It wasn't a request. Etta seemed to understand that. "Then stay," the old woman said. "But sleep. You're no use to him exhausted." She turned back to her work table and began preparing something. A combination of ingredients that Saphira didn't fully recognize, measured with the precision of someone who had done this particular thing before. Saphira sat down on the narrow bench by the wall, kept her eyes on the pup. He had turned his head slightly in her direction. She didn't know if that meant anything. She decided it did. She was asleep within minutes. The deep, sudden sleep of someone who had been running on determination alone and had finally run out of road. She did not see Etta return to the table. She did not see the old woman lift the medallion a second time, angling it toward the lamp with hands that were, for the first time all evening, not entirely steady. She did not hear what Etta said, but she said something. One word, barely a breath. Impossible. They came down from the mountain in the early morning. the pup still wrapped against Saphira's chest. His fever had broken sometime before dawn. Etta had said little about it, only that he was stable, that he needed warmth and rest, and that Saphira should return to her village and wait. When Saphira had asked wait for what, Etta had looked at her with those sharp, unhurried eyes, and said simply, "You'll know." Saphira had not found that particularly satisfying. But the pup was breathing easier. His nose was cold the way a healthy animal's nose should be cold. He had accepted a small amount of food that morning. Not much, but something. And when she had lifted him from the table to leave, he had made a sound against her collarbone that she could only describe as relieved. She was halfway through the village when she heard the horses. Not one or two. Many. The sound of a group moving with purpose, the kind of coordinated rhythm that didn't belong on the narrow roads leading into a settlement this small and this far from anywhere. She stepped to the side of the road without thinking about it. They came around the bend in the tree line and the world changed. Wolves first, large, disciplined, moving in formation on both sides of the road with the quiet efficiency of animals that had been trained to do exactly this. Then riders, 8 of them, armored in dark metal, bearing no banner she recognized but carrying themselves with the absolute certainty of men who had never needed one. And then him. Saphira would not have been able to explain, afterward, how she knew immediately that he was different from the others. He was not louder. He was not more decorated. He did not do anything that the riders beside him did not also do. But the space around him was different. The riders gave him room without being asked. The wolves oriented toward him the way iron filings orient toward a magnet, not looking directly at him, but arranged around him, aware of him at every moment. Even the horses seemed to carry themselves differently in his proximity. He was tall in the saddle, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair, and the kind of face that had been arranged by years of responsibility into something that gave very little away. His eyes moved across the village with the practiced efficiency of someone who assessed every space he entered and found most of them wanting. He hadn't seen her yet. Then, from the far end of the road, a commotion. 3 riders Saphira hadn't noticed, positioned ahead of the main group, already at the edge of the village, had stopped. 2 of them were wolves she didn't recognize. Large, scarred. Watching the bundle against her chest with an intensity that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. One of them stepped forward. "The pup," he said. His voice was flat and certain, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Hand him over." Saphira's arms tightened without her deciding to tighten them. "I don't know who you are," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "And I don't know what you want, but you're not taking him." The wolf's eyes narrowed. He took another step, and then stopped. The quality of the air changed. Saphira felt it before she understood it. A pressure, subtle and total, like the moment before a storm when every living thing goes quiet because something in the atmosphere has shifted beyond the ordinary range of weather. The wolves at the roadside went still. The riders behind her stopped moving entirely. The man on horseback had turned his attention toward them. He did nothing else. He simply looked. The wolf who had spoken, the one who had stepped forward with such certainty, such ownership of the moment, took one look at the rider and stepped back. He held for just a moment longer than necessary, long enough to make clear that he was leaving because he had chosen to, not because he had been made to. "This isn't finished," he said, to no one in particular, to everyone. Then he turned his horse around entirely. The man dismounted. He walked toward Saphira with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never needed to hurry, because the world reliably waited for him. Up close, he was even more composed than he had appeared on horseback, controlled in the way that very powerful things are controlled, not because control was easy, but because the alternative had long ago stopped being an option. His eyes went to the bundle against her chest, and for the first time, something moved behind them. something that was not composure, and not authority, and not the careful blankness of a man who had learned to keep his face for himself. "Where did you find him?" he said. His voice was quiet. That surprised her. She had expected commands. She had expected the same flat certainty as the wolf who had just retreated. What she heard instead was something she recognized, had heard before, in her own workroom, in her own voice, when something fragile was in front of her and she was trying very hard not to show how frightened she was. "In the forest," she said. "During the storm. He was alone." The man looked at the pup for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Really looked at her, the way almost no one did, with the full weight of his attention landing on her like something physical. "He's alive," he said. Not a question. Almost not even a statement. Something quieter than both. "Yes," Saphira said. "He's alive." The man exhaled once, slow and controlled. "I am Gideon Dolores," he said, "and that is my son." They returned to Etta's cabin first. Gideon said little on the road. His men kept their distance without being asked. Arranged around him and Saphira at a radius that felt less like escort and more like the natural consequence of who he was, the way objects don't crowd a fire but don't stray too far from it either. He walked beside her, not ahead, beside. She wasn't sure what to do with that. The pup had gone very still when Gideon approached him. Not frightened, not welcoming, but watchful in a way that seemed too considered for something so young. When Gideon had reached out to touch him, carefully, with one large hand, the pup had allowed it. But he had also shifted, almost imperceptibly, so that his back was pressed more firmly against Saphira's arm. Gideon had noticed. He hadn't said anything. At the cabin, Etta opened the door before they reached it. She looked at Gideon for a long moment, the same sharp assessing look she had turned on Saphira 2 nights ago, except that this version of it carried something else underneath. Recognition, perhaps, or the particular gravity of someone who had suspected something and was now being proven right. She stepped aside to let them in. It was there, in the low-ceilinged warmth of the cabin, that Gideon finally looked at Saphira directly and asked his first question. "When did you find him?" "The night of the storm," she said. "He was at the tree line, already injured. His leg. The joint, not broken. The swelling has come down." He nodded slowly, processing. "Then, the fever. When did it start?" "The same night. It worsened through the next day." She paused. "It broke this morning." Something moved across his face at that. Fast, and then gone, controlled back into composure before it fully arrived. But she had seen it. The brief, unguarded cost of hearing that the fever had worsened before it had broken. The information landing somewhere, it mattered. "He ate?" Gideon asked. "A little, this morning before we came down." "What?" The question surprised her, the specificity of it. "Soft meat," she said. "Cooked, small pieces." He nodded again. She had the sense he was cataloging everything she said, storing it with the precision of someone who had learned that details were not small things. "You carried him up the mountain yourself," he said. It wasn't a question. There wasn't another option. He looked at her in a way that was difficult to interpret. Not gratitude, or not only that. Something more like the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation he thought he had already assessed. He turned to the pup then, crouching down to his level in a single unhurried movement. Up close, without the horses and the riders and the theater of the road, he seemed both more and less imposing than he had before. More, because the quietness of him was even more apparent at close range. The absolute stillness of someone who had learned to contain an enormous amount within a very controlled space. Less, because of the way he looked at his son. He didn't reach out immediately this time. He just looked at him, took him in. The injured leg, the clean bandaging, the way the pup's eyes tracked him with that watchful, uncertain attention. "Hey," Gideon said, quietly. The pup's ears moved. He didn't go to his father, but he didn't look away either. Gideon stayed where he was, crouched at the pup's level, giving him time that the situation didn't technically require, and that he gave anyway. That evening they prepared to leave for the kingdom. Gideon's men assembled with the efficiency of long practice. Horses were readied. A traveling arrangement was organized that Saphira didn't fully understand, but that seemed to involve a great deal of unspoken communication between men who had worked together long enough to not need words. Gideon crouched down and held out his hand. The pup looked at it. For a moment, just a moment, he leaned forward, some instinct in him reaching toward his father. Then something shifted. His breathing changed. He pulled back and pressed himself against Saphira's side with a small, insistent sound that required no interpretation. Gideon stayed where he was, hand still extended, for a beat longer than necessary. Then he lowered it. One of the men said quietly, from somewhere behind them, "He won't eat. We tried. He won't take anything." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Will you ride with us?" he asked. His voice was even, carefully even, until he settled. Saphira looked at the pup. He was still watching her, still making that small, insistent sound, still pressed as close to the edge of the traveling blanket as he could get, as close to the direction she was standing as the space allowed. There would be time for questions later. Right now, there was only what was needed. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." She did not look back at the road that led home. There would be time for that later. Before we continue, if you felt something in this first chapter that made you want to stay, please leave a like. It takes 1 second, and it means a lot to me. Chapter 2. The kingdom announced itself before they arrived. Not through banners or walls or the sound of bells, though there were all of those things. Through the people on the road. They had been riding for 2 days when Saphira first noticed it. A farmer stopped his cart at the roadside and removed his hat. A woman carrying water from a well set her buckets down and stood still. 2 boys at the edge of a field, young enough that the gesture was clearly learned rather than felt, straightened and went quiet as the party passed. None of them looked at Gideon directly. None of them looked away either. Saphira had never seen anything like it. It was not the performance of people who feared their king. It was something older and more complicated than fear. The instinctive orientation of a world that had been organized around a single point of gravity for so long that the habit had become indistinguishable from the landscape. She filed it away and said nothing. The castle itself was exactly what it should have been. Stone and discipline and the particular silence of a place that had learned to contain a great deal without showing it. The courtyard when they arrived was not crowded, but the people who were present managed to convey the impression of an audience without doing anything so obvious as gathering. Stable hands who moved too slowly, a steward who appeared at exactly the wrong moment to be coincidental. They were looking at the pup. Saphira felt it. The collective exhale of a household that had been holding its breath for days, finally released. She understood, perhaps for the first time with her whole body rather than just her mind, what the small creature pressed against her collarbone had meant to all of these people. What his absence had cost them. What his return meant. She held him a little more carefully after that. Gideon moved through the arrival with the efficiency of a man returning to a machine he understood completely, speaking quietly to the steward, receiving reports from 2 of his riders simultaneously, signing something that was placed in front of him without breaking stride. He was everywhere and nowhere, present in the way that very capable people are present, occupying exactly as much space as the situation required, and not 1 inch more. And yet, she noticed that every few minutes, no matter where he was or who was speaking to him, his eyes moved to where she was standing with the pup, not checking the pup, not performing concern, just locating them, making sure they were still there. She was given a room by a woman who introduced herself as the head housekeeper. and spoke with the brisk warmth of someone who had learned to make people feel welcome without wasting either of their time. The room was warm and clean, and larger than Saphira's entire cottage. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands for a moment. The pup was asleep against her knee, finally deeply asleep in the boneless way of a creature that had decided it was safe to let go completely. She became aware, sitting there, of how cold she was. She had been cold for 3 days. She had simply not noticed until now, when the warmth of the room had made the cold in her bones suddenly perceptible by contrast. She was still in the same clothes she had been wearing when she found him. She had not thought about it once. There was a knock at the door. A young woman entered carrying a bundle of folded fabric. Clothes, Saphira realized, clean and warm, in the muted, practical tones of someone who had made a considered guess about what would be useful rather than impressive. "From the Alpha King," the young woman said, and left before Saphira could respond. Saphira looked at the clothes for a long moment. They were the right size. Not approximately right. Precisely right. The kind of accurate that required more than a passing glance. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Being cared for was one thing. Being observed carefully enough to be cared for correctly was something else entirely. Something she didn't have a category for yet, because no one had done it before. She picked up the folded clothes carefully, set them beside her on the bed. Outside the window, the castle was resuming its ordinary sounds. Footsteps, distant voices, the rhythm of a household finding its shape again after days of disruption. Saphira sat with the sleeping pup warm against her knee, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that someone had seen her. She wasn't sure what to do with that yet, so she filed it away. For later. She found the rhythm of the castle quickly, the way she found the rhythm of most places. By watching, by staying quiet, by making herself useful before anyone thought to question whether she belonged. The pup, Soren, she had learned his name now, had heard it spoken a dozen times since their arrival, was recovering steadily. His leg was bearing weight. His appetite had returned in earnest. He slept deeply and woke alert, and the watchful exhaustion that had frightened her on the mountain had given way to something approaching ordinary puppyhood. Curiosity, movement, the occasional small chaos of a young creature testing the edges of its world. He still followed her everywhere. The castle staff had stopped finding this remarkable after the first day. It had simply become part of the landscape. Soren moving through the halls, Saphira nearby, the two of them existing in the particular orbit of a creature, and the person it had decided was its fixed point. She was watching him investigate a tapestry with great seriousness one morning when Gideon arrived for breakfast. He came without announcement. No steward, no riders, just the man himself moving through the doorway with the quiet certainty she had come to recognize as simply how he occupied space. He looked at Soren first, the way he always did. Then at Saphira. A brief acknowledgement, the kind that had become ordinary between them without either of them deciding to make it so. He sat down. A servant began placing food on the table. Bread, soft cheese, sliced fruit, a small bowl of something warm. Gideon gestured toward Soren. "He can eat at the table," he said. The servant hesitated. Of course. What would the young heir prefer? Gideon looked at his son. Soren had abandoned the tapestry and was now sitting at Saphira's feet, watching the food with transparent interest. "He doesn't like fruit," Saphira said without thinking. "The texture. He'll eat around it if you put it on the plate. Bread is fine, but not the crust. He pulls it off and leaves it. He likes the warm dish, whatever that is." She became aware of the quality of the silence in the room. Gideon was looking at her, not with displeasure, with something more careful than that. The expression of a man absorbing information that should not have been new to him, and was. "Thank you," he said, evenly. The servant arranged the plate accordingly and set it down. Soren approached it with the focused gravity of a small creature, taking food seriously, and ate everything except the crusts, which he did indeed pull off and leave in a neat pile at the edge. Gideon watched this without speaking. Breakfast continued. Gideon ate. Saphira ate. Soren finished his plate and relocated to the warm patch of sunlight beneath the window with the satisfied deliberateness of someone who had decided the morning's work was complete. Gideon's eyes followed him. "How long did the nightmares last?" he asked. Saphira looked up. "Pardon?" "At the healer's cabin. Or before. You said he slept. But did he sleep well?" She considered this. The first 2 nights were difficult. He woke often. By the 3rd night it was better. Gideon nodded. Something moved across his face, there and gone. "He had them before," he said. "After his mother died. They stopped eventually." A pause. "I didn't know if they'd come back." He said it simply, without performance, the way people mention things they have carried alone for long enough that the weight has become ordinary. Saphira said nothing. It didn't seem to require a response. They sat in the quiet for a moment, the comfortable, undemanding quiet of 2 people who had spent enough time managing the same small crisis to have arrived at something resembling ease. That afternoon she passed an open doorway and stopped. Gideon was inside, sitting on the floor, not at his desk, not in his chair. On the floor, with his back against the wall and Soren in his lap, and a book open between them that he was clearly reading aloud, one finger tracing the words at a pace that wasn't quite right yet, too fast, then correcting, then too slow, the careful awkwardness of someone relearning something they should never have let go unused. He hadn't heard her stop. Soren had. The pup's eyes found her in the doorway, and his tail moved once. Acknowledgement, not summons. He didn't get up. He stayed where he was, settled in his father's lap with the particular quality of stillness that meant he had chosen to be there. Saphira stood in the doorway for just a moment, Gideon on the floor, reading slowly, adjusting his pace for a child who couldn't tell him to slow down. Not a king doing a kingly thing. Not an alpha performing fatherhood for an audience. Just a man sitting on the floor with his son, trying to learn the shape of something he had let go thin. She walked on before he saw her, but she carried it with her, that image, small and specific and entirely unguarded, the way she carried things that mattered before she had decided yet that they mattered, the way she always had. It was the head housekeeper who raised the alarm. She came to Saphira's door just after the castle had gone quiet for the night. A brisk knock, a voice kept deliberately even in the way of someone managing their own concern with professional precision. "The young heir isn't in his rooms." Saphira was awake and moving before the sentence finished. The search was quiet but thorough, the kind of organized efficiency that suggested this household had protocols for crises and had learned them from necessity. Servants took the east wing. 2 guards took the courtyard. Someone was sent to check the stables, because Soren had shown an interest in the horses that morning that had required gentle redirection twice. Gideon said nothing. He moved through the search with the same controlled precision he brought to everything. But Saphira had spent enough time watching him now to read the difference between his ordinary stillness and this one. This was not stillness. This was containment. She checked the places she knew first, the warm patch of sunlight beneath the window in the breakfast room, which he had claimed as his by the 2nd day. The alcove near the kitchen where someone had made the mistake of giving him a piece of bread once, and he had not forgotten it. The corridor near the library, where the carpet was thick enough to sleep on, and the light from the wall sconces stayed on longest. Empty. 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 She was on her way back to report when she turned the corner of her own corridor and stopped. He was there, curled on the stone floor outside her door, his nose tucked against his tail, his breathing the slow and absolute rhythm of something that had chosen its place deliberately and then let go completely into sleep. Saphira stood very still. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Someone had followed, or had been coming from the other direction. She didn't turn around immediately. She needed one more moment with this, with the image of him there on the cold floor outside her door. She turned then. Gideon stood at the end of the corridor. He was looking at his son, at the floor, at the specific location Soren had chosen. His face was doing the thing it rarely did. Not composure, not the controlled blankness of a king managing his expression, but something underneath all of that. Something that had been there the whole time, and was simply, for this one moment, visible. He looked at Soren for a long time. Then he looked at Saphira. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the corridor hadn't already said more clearly. One of the guards appeared at the far end of the hall, saw the scene, and quietly withdrew. Then it was just the two of them, and the sleeping pup between them, and the silence of a castle that had gone still around something it didn't need to be told was important. Gideon crossed the corridor. He crouched down beside his son with the same unhurried care he had brought to the breakfast table, to the book, to every small moment of relearning that Saphira had watched him move through in the past days. He put one hand very gently on Soren's side. The pup stirred, blinked, looked at his father. Didn't move. Gideon stayed where he was, crouched on the stone floor, his hand on his son's side, not lifting him, not redirecting him, just present. After a moment, he looked up at Saphira. "I'll have a bed brought," he said quietly. "For him, outside your door." It was the most practical possible response to the situation. It was also something else entirely, and they both knew it. Saphira nodded. She looked at Soren, already drifting back toward sleep, his father's hand warm on his side, his nose pointed at the gap beneath her door. She opened her door. "Bring the bed," she said, "but leave him there tonight. He chose the floor. Let him have it." Gideon looked at her for a moment. Then something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The idea of one. The shape of something that had been unused long enough that it arrived imperfectly, like his reading pace, like all the things he was learning to do again. "Good night, Saphira," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She noticed. She went inside and closed the door softly behind her, and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the quiet of the corridor. Outside, she could hear Soren breathing. She didn't move for a long time. 3 weeks into her stay, Saphira established a routine. Mornings with Soren, breakfast, the slow circuit of the castle grounds that his leg now managed without difficulty. The particular negotiations involved in convincing a young wolf that lessons were not optional. Afternoons more varied. Sometimes the castle healer consulted her on the pup's continued recovery. Sometimes she simply sat in the warm room off the courtyard while Soren slept, and the castle moved around them both. Gideon appeared when he could. That was how she had come to think of it. Not that he visited, not that he scheduled time, but that he appeared in the margins of his own responsibilities whenever those margins allowed. Breakfast, when the council permitted. The evening circuit sometimes, walking beside her while Soren investigated the grounds with the systematic thoroughness of a creature mapping his territory. He spoke to Soren differently now. Not better, exactly. There had been nothing wrong before, but differently, less carefully. The slight over-precision of a man monitoring his own performance had given way to something more ordinary. He got things wrong still. He corrected. He tried again. It was Soren himself who gave her the first thread. They were in the library. Soren had claimed a specific chair in the corner that received afternoon sun, and defended it against all comers with the quiet ferocity of the very young, when he said something that didn't fit. He had been telling her, in the partial and non-linear way of children recounting things, about the journey that had preceded the storm. The caravan. The wolves who had traveled with them. "Brennan said we were going the wrong way," he said. Saphira looked up from the book she wasn't reading. "Who is Brennan?" He was one of the guards. A pause. "He argued with the roadman, the one with the maps." The navigator? Soren considered this word. He told Brennan the road was the same, but Brennan said it wasn't. He said it with the easy certainty of a child reporting something he hadn't understood, but had stored perfectly, the way children stored things that had been loud or frightening, or simply unusual in the texture of an ordinary day. Then he climbed down from his chair and went to find his ball, and the conversation was over. Saphira sat with it for a moment. She was not an investigator. She had no framework for the politics of a royal caravan, no knowledge of the roads between kingdoms, no way to assess whether a disagreement between a guard and a navigator was significant or simply ordinary. But she knew how illness worked. She knew that a single symptom meant nothing. 2 symptoms that didn't fit together meant something. 3 meant you stopped what you were doing and paid attention. She found Gideon that evening in the corridor outside the council chamber. She told him what Soren had said. Simply, without interpretation, the way she reported symptoms. Here is what I observed. Here is the exact wording. Here is why I thought you should know. Gideon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. That particular quality of stillness that she now recognized as thinking rather than composure. He mentioned the guard's name, he said. Brennan, yes. Soren doesn't remember names. He never has. A pause. He remembered that one. He didn't explain what that meant. He didn't need to. They stood in the corridor for a moment longer, the sound of the council chamber muffled behind its door. Thank you, Gideon said. The same 2 words as the breakfast table, weeks ago. But they had weight now that they hadn't carried then. The weight of everything that had accumulated between that morning and this evening. All the small moments that had built into something neither of them had named yet. Saphira nodded. She walked back toward Soren. Behind her, she heard Gideon change direction. Not toward his chambers. Toward the records room. The answer came within a week. Saphira wasn't present for most of it. The quiet, methodical work of men pulling records and cross-referencing routes and locating a guard named Brennan, who turned out to be not difficult to find at all, once someone began looking with the right question. She knew it was happening the way she knew most things in the castle happened. Through the changed quality of the air, the slightly altered rhythms of the household, the way certain doors that had always been open were now closed. Gideon told her what he had found one evening, briefly and without theater. The caravan route had been changed 3 days before departure. The order had come through a senior advisor, a man named Aldrich Voss, who had served the court for 11 years and was trusted in the particular way that people who have been present for a long time become trusted, not through examination, but through accumulation. The change had been presented as practical: a bridge under repair, an alternative road that added half a day but avoided the delay. There was no bridge under repair. Voss had not attempted to have Soren killed. Gideon was precise about this. He said it once, flatly, so that Saphira understood the exact shape of what had happened. The plan, as best they could reconstruct it, had been to create circumstances in which the heir might be separated from his escort, might be found by the rival pack, might be removed from succession through apparent misadventure rather than violence. A cleaner solution, a deniable one. It had gone wrong. The storm had been worse than anticipated. Soren had been carried further than anyone expected. And a woman in a village no one had ever heard of had found him before the rival pack could. Saphira received this information quietly. She thought about the night of the storm, the tree line, the small gray shape at the base of the oak, the weight of him against her chest on the mountain. She thought about how many things had needed to go wrong in exactly the right way for her to be standing in this corridor. She didn't say any of that. "What will you do?" she asked. "What needs to be done?" Gideon said. The hearing was held in the Great Hall 2 days later. Saphira had not been invited and had not asked to attend. But Soren had been restless all morning, pacing the length of the warm room, returning to her repeatedly, unable to settle. And when one of the younger servants mentioned quietly that the hall was open to the household, She had carried him there without deliberating about it. They stood at the back. The hall was fuller than she had expected. Not crowded, but present. The castle's population arranged along the walls with the careful stillness of people who understood the significance of what they were witnessing and had decided to witness it properly. Voss stood at the center. He was older than she had imagined. A composed man, silver-haired, with the careful bearing of someone who had survived many courts by understanding exactly how visible to make himself at any given moment. He did not look frightened. He looked like a man calculating costs, even now. Gideon sat at the far end of the hall. He did not look like a man conducting a hearing. He looked like a man who had already finished the work, the investigation, the verification, the reconstruction of every decision that had been made, and had arrived here only to make the conclusion visible. He spoke without raising his voice. Saphira was too far back to hear every word, but she heard enough. She heard the route, the order, the guard's name. She heard the moment when Voss began to respond, and Gideon continued speaking, not loudly, not with anger, but with the absolute certainty of someone who had no remaining interest in the defense. She heard the titles stripped, the privileges revoked, the positions dissolved. She heard the banishment, and then she watched something she had not expected. Gideon stood. He crossed the hall, past the assembled household, past the advisors, past the guards, and he stopped in front of where she and Soren were standing at the back. He crouched down. He looked at his son. Soren looked back at him for a moment. Then he stepped forward and pressed his head against his father's shoulder with the simple, total trust of a creature that had decided, finally, where it belonged. Gideon put his arms around him. He didn't say anything. He didn't look up at the hall. He didn't perform it for anyone present. He just held his son in the back of the great hall while the household watched and understood, without being told, exactly what this moment was about. It was not about Voss. It was not about the caravan. It was not about succession or politics or the security of the kingdom. It was about a father who had nearly lost his child and was not going to pretend, in this room or any other room, that the most important thing that had just happened was anything other than what it was. Saphira watched. She felt something loosen in her chest, slow and quiet, like something that had been held carefully for a long time finally being set down. Soren's eyes found her over his father's shoulder. His tail moved once. She began packing on a Tuesday. There was no particular reason for Tuesday. It was simply the morning she woke up and understood, with the quiet clarity of something that had been true for a while before she noticed it, that her reason for being here was finished. Soren was well. His leg had healed completely. She had checked it herself the previous evening, running her hands along the joint the way she had done every few days since the mountain, and found nothing. No heat, no resistance. The movement was clean and full, and entirely ordinary. He ate without difficulty. He slept without nightmares. He had begun to follow Gideon through the castle in the mornings with the particular purposeful trot of a creature who had decided to learn the shape of someone's day. He still came to her door each night, but he came to his father first now. That was the right order of things. She folded the clothes that had been brought to her. The practical, precisely sized clothes that she had stopped thinking about with discomfort and had simply worn, and set them on the bed. They weren't hers to take. She left them folded neatly, the way she left things in other people's spaces. Like she had never quite settled. Her own things took almost no time to pack. She had arrived with very little. She was leaving with the same. She wrote a note for Soren, short, because she didn't know yet how much he could read, and because the things she wanted to say were not things that fit easily into words for a child or for anyone else. She told him he was brave. She told him he had been the easiest patient she had ever had, which was almost true. She told him to eat his breakfast. She left the note on the small bed outside her door. She did not write a note for Gideon. She had started one, had sat with the blank paper for longer than the blank paper deserved. had put the pen down without writing anything, because everything she could think to say was either too small for what she meant, or too large for what she had any right to mean. She left before the castle was fully awake. The courtyard was quiet. One stable hand, 2 guards at the gate who nodded without stopping her. The particular gray light of early morning that made everything look like it was still deciding whether to be day. She had told no one she was leaving except the head housekeeper, the previous evening, briefly and practically, the way she handled most things. The housekeeper had looked at her for a moment. "I'll let the Alpha King know," she said. "You don't need to wake him," Saphira said. "No," the housekeeper agreed. "I don't." She had understood something in that exchange that she hadn't let herself examine too closely. She examined it now, walking through the quiet courtyard, her pack on her shoulder, the castle at her back. She had spent her whole life arriving in other people's emergencies and leaving when the emergency was over. She was good at it. She had built something like a life from it. The satisfaction of being needed, the clean ending of a problem resolved, the road back to her own small world where things were the right size for her. She understood, walking through the gate, that she did not want to leave. She left anyway, because wanting to stay was not the same as being asked, and Saphira Payne had learned, early and thoroughly, not to need things she hadn't been offered. The road stretched ahead of her, pale in the early light. She didn't look back. She had never looked back. It had always seemed like the stronger choice. She was less certain of that now than she had ever been, and she walked faster because of it, and the castle grew smaller behind her, and she did not turn around. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard her name. She didn't stop immediately. She told herself it was the wind, or a trick of the morning quiet, or simply her own mind producing what it wanted to hear. She had walked away from things before. She knew how to keep moving. Then she heard it again. Not her name this time. Just a sound. High and urgent and completely familiar. The sound she had learned to read before she had learned anything else about him. She turned. He was running. Not loping, not trotting. Running, flat out, ears back, covering the road between them with the absolute single-mindedness of a creature that had woken and found something wrong and was correcting it as fast as his legs would carry him. Saphira set her pack down. She didn't decide to. It was simply on the ground, and she was crouching, and then he was in her arms, momentum and warmth, and the familiar weight of him pressing against her with a force that nearly knocked her back. She held on. He made a sound against her neck that she had no category for. Relief and reproach and something else that had no name in any language she knew. She didn't say anything. She held him, and he held on, and the road was quiet around them, and the castle was visible in the distance, and she did not look at it. She heard footsteps, unhurried, certain, the particular rhythm of a man who had stopped running because he could see what he was running toward. She stood slowly, Soren still pressed against her side, his breathing evening out now that the world had rearranged itself back into the correct order. Gideon stopped a few feet away. He looked at her for a moment, then at Soren, then at her pack on the ground, then at her face. "You left without taking the clothes," he said. She blinked. "They weren't mine. I had them made for you." She didn't answer that. He took one step closer. His voice was the same as always, quiet even, giving nothing away that he hadn't decided to give. But he was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the corridor outside her door, the night Soren had slept on the floor, like someone setting down the last of whatever he had been using to keep himself at a careful distance. "You came here because he needed you," Gideon said. "That's over now. I know that." A pause. "But you should know something." She waited. "He is not the only one." The road was very quiet. Soren sat between them on the ground and looked from one to the other with the expression of a creature who understood the situation completely and was waiting, with impressive patience, for the adults to catch up. Saphira looked at Gideon. She thought about Tuesday morning, the folded clothes, the note she hadn't been able to write, the gate and the gray light, and the decision she had made before anyone could make it for her. She thought about wanting to stay, not being the same as being asked. She had been asked now. "The clothes fit well," she said finally. "It would be a waste." Something happened at the corner of his mouth, not almost a smile this time. Soren made a decisive sound and started back toward the castle, not looking back to check if they were following. He already knew. 3 months later, Saphira learned that Soren had 2 speeds in the morning. The first was the speed of a child who had forgotten there were rules, fast, purposeful, already halfway to wherever he was going before anyone could redirect him. The second was the speed of a child who remembered the rules and had decided they were negotiable, slower, quieter, with frequent pauses to establish whether he was being watched. She caught him at the bread basket on a Tuesday morning. He froze. She looked at him. He looked at her with the expression of someone calculating whether the evidence was conclusive. From the doorway, without turning around, Gideon said, "Put it back." Soren put it back. Then he sat down at the table with the dignified composure of someone who had never intended to do otherwise. Saphira looked at Gideon. He was already looking at her, the brief, quiet look that had become its own language between them over the past months. The look that said, "I saw that. Did you see that?" The look that meant they were watching the same thing together, which was different from watching it alone, which was how she had watched everything for most of her life. She sat down. Soren reached for the bread again, more slowly this time, testing the precise boundary of what constituted putting it back. "Soren," she said. He sighed with his whole body and withdrew his hand. Gideon sat down across from her. Outside the window, the castle was beginning its morning. Footsteps, distant voices, the unhurried rhythm of a household that had found its shape again. Inside, it was just breakfast. Just the 3 of them. Just Tuesday. Some people spend their whole lives being needed. Very few of them get to discover what it feels like to be chosen. Saphira Payne did. That was enough. That was everything. Thank you so much for being here until the very end. If this story stayed with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. I truly love hearing from you. And if you want more stories, subscribe, be part of my library. A new story is always waiting. I'll see you in the next one.